Hello, my name is Brian Osborne of the Photo Classroom, and this is another session of today's Photo Minute. It's great to be back with you, and today I wanted to do part one of a two-part series on a great feature on our camera, a critical feature on our camera in many ways, and that is called Auto ISO. We've talked about in other sessions how important the ISO is, that if you want a certain aperture and shutter speed combination given a lighting situation, that you may need to raise or sometimes lower your ISO in order to get that right aperture and shutter speed combination. However, that's also a lot for us to keep up with. It's very easy for the shutter speed to start dropping if the light levels drop. And if we don't notice that, and if we don't raise the ISO back up ourselves, then we're going to find that the results of our pictures are probably not going to turn out the way that we want them to. And so having the camera have the ability to control the ISO for us, especially when it's customizable, is really a great option. Now, the reason I say customizable is that it wouldn't necessarily do us a lot of good if the camera raises the ISO and it doesn't need to, giving us more noise in our images. And so us being able to control why the camera would raise the ISO and what parameters it would do that under is kind of key to this entire process. Almost all Nikons that I'm familiar with have the ability to customize auto ISO. Many of the newer or even the last couple years worth of Canon cameras all have the ability to set the minimum shutter speed, which is the customizability that we're looking for under auto ISO. Some of the older Canons, and I'm sure there's some other cameras on the market, they all have auto ISO, but whether you can customize that as much, you might need to check on your own camera and make sure that that's an option so that it gives you the results that we're hoping you're looking for. I wanted to show you on my Nikon camera how that setup would be done. I don't have a Canon to show you, but it's actually very, very similar. It's actually under the same menu item, menu section with about the same parameters as well. So let me show you my screen here. And you'll see that I went under the shooting menu, which is the camera symbol menu, and I went to ISO sensitivity settings, and I'm going to go under that menu, and the first option that we want to talk about is ISO sensitivity. This is your current manual ISO setting, but this is also going to be the minimum ISO that the camera is going to use when you allow it to control it itself in auto ISO. So 100 is usually a great starting place. And usually the one that I just leave on my camera unless I've done something more particular. I'm going to turn the feature on here under the menu. Now on many cameras, we'll talk about this in part two, you can actually turn auto ISO on and off without going under the menu, but this is certainly a great starting place as well for us to just turn the feature on. Then it ungrays two final parameters. The next parameter is kind of a leave it and forget it as well, but you need to make sure you set that correctly in the first place, and that is what is the highest ISO you're willing for the camera to go to if you're going to allow the camera to control the ISO range. Remember, we talked about in a previous session that you might need to do your own testing to find out exactly what how high of an ISO that you're comfortable with the noise levels, and how high are you willing to go in your specific camera. But 12,800 is certainly a comfortable place for me to allow the camera to go up to. And so I don't often change the 100. I don't usually change the minimum. I don't usually change the maximum. The setting that is critically important, and many people miss this because of how it's labeled, is the minimum shutter speed. This is the parameter that we want to be able to control if we're going to allow the camera to do auto ISO for us. And so when you first look at it, it says auto, and you go, okay, auto sounds like it takes care of it. Not really. It doesn't really know what your purposes are in terms of the shutter speed minimum that it should be looking for. So I'm going to go under that, and now I can pull up this whole list of shutter speeds, and this is what I want to be able to adjust. If I were just doing walk-around photography, just general handheld photography with a normal lens, 60th of a second would probably be a great starting place for the minimum shutter speed. But obviously, if I'm going to be using a telephoto lens with a lot more shake, or if I'm going to be doing action photography, then I'm going to need to be choosing a much faster shutter speed, maybe 1,000th of a second, just as a starting place for this example. And so you need to make sure that you set this minimum shutter speed correctly, and you cannot set the minimum shutter speed without being under the menu of the camera. That's universal for both Canon and for Nikon cameras. So I'm going to set that here, and then if I were to go out to my main screen, you'll actually see what's taking place. So it's blinking auto ISO telling me that the camera's in charge. It's the current ISO that it needs is 2500. If I point the camera at a little bit more light, we probably get that to vary slightly. Get that to update on your screen. There we go. Drop down to 800. So it's going to change it shot by shot, literally, in order to give you the fastest shutter speed you need, and in order to give you, in this case, I'm in aperture priority mode, so it's going to give me, I'm going to get to choose the aperture. I've already, in essence, chosen the shutter speed because I chose that as my minimum shutter speed, and then the camera is going to give me whatever ISO it can, up to the maximum, to give me the shutter speed that I've requested. We'll get into a few more of the intermediate parts of this, but I just wanted to introduce this topic to you. Auto ISO is a great feature to use. I use it a lot of times. Many of you have probably been watching some of my wildlife pictures on the Facebook page and on Instagram, and you'll probably notice there's a whole range of ISOs when I put the camera settings down, and that is because often I'm letting the camera control the ISO, but I've set up the parameters correctly in order to get the most out of this feature. So my encouragement for you today is to check out your camera, see what the customizability is, make sure you know what you can and cannot do and where those settings are controlled under the menu of your camera to set up ISO and to turn it on and to use it correctly. And then we'll be back with a session 2 of this to talk a little bit more about when you might not use auto ISO and a couple of the kind of pitfalls, common mistakes that are made when using auto ISO if you aren't aware of some important techniques. I hope this has been helpful. Continue to follow along. I hope you have the camera in your hands and you're practicing. And thank you again for joining us for today's Photo Minute.